Hello everybody, this is Mike. I am a author and game designer. I was a additional designer on Daggerheart as a freelancer, but these streams are all just my own kind of personal approach to and opinions about the game. I don't speak for anybody else here. As you can see, we are using the community gaming license because I'm going to be referring some to the SRD or material from the SRD and then doing some new creation of adversaries. Specifically, we're going to be doing social adversaries today, which are one of my many things that I love the most about Daggerheart because they provide some structure and tools for running the types of scenes that some other games, either intentionally or just because of their structure, don't necessarily give you the same types of tools, and try to talk about how I see those tools as being useful and what you can get from using them. But we can also talk some about how the structures for something like this they are meant to be a menu and they're meant to be helpful rather than meant to be like dogmatic and limiting. Which is kind of how I see a lot of elements in Daggerheart, right? I think the environments framework is meant to be inspirational and a way of structuring resources, not as a dictate of how you have to handle certain types of scenes. So, with all that said, we are going to jump over to this. Okay, so this is a little big, and I'm just going to move my camera over a tiny bit. So now we are tweaked. So someone on YouTube mentioned that they really like seeing my notes because it makes it easier to follow along. So I'm going to have these up for much of the stream. But if I get on a tear about something that's not really related to this, I may jump back over to the other overlay. So did my intro, did disclaimer. When you're doing homebrewing / designing for publication with the community gaming license, of course, always refer to the SRD as your primary source. You can also be looking at the homebrew kit. And then if you're just making stuff for your own game, right, your home game, not for publication, of course, you can refer to the core book as well, or things from the Void. But for this, I'm focusing very specifically on resources from the SRD. As with other types of adversaries, when I am designing social adversaries, I start from the question of narrative function. What is this adversary supposed to do specifically within the scene? Are they the kind of assistant or advisor to a more powerful character and serving as a bit of like an intermediary or a roadblock between the player characters and whatever that more powerful, maybe higher tier non-player character might be? Are they the main opposition in the scene? Are they somebody who is a third or fourth party interfering in a conflict or an interaction between the player characters and some other group? The ways that a social adversary can create challenge in a scene parallel but are not exactly coterminous with the way that other adversaries often pose challenges or create obstacles in the kinds of scenes where we're using them. So inclusion of the social type of adversary brings that same structure that other adversaries have into another domain, another realm of play, depending on how we are thinking about RPGs, right? In D&D and fantasy RPG conversations, a lot of people use the 3-pillar idea, right? Combat, exploration, and roleplay or social interaction. Social adversaries, therefore, are an adversary structure, but in another pillar. Daggerheart does not have those formal divisions. We have adversary types, we have environment types, but it's really one system throughout the whole game. In terms of basic stuff using social adversaries, I tend to treat social adversaries as ways to escalate a scene or to create or introduce specific challenges along an interpersonal axis, right? The courtesan character is not there to stab a character most of the time. A spy might right? Pose as somebody and then go for an attack. But social adversaries are largely about presenting interpersonal challenges and threats. And so when I am running social adversaries, one of the most important traits that they have that I look at is their stress. Because social adversaries will often mark stress to use some of their features, as other adversaries do. But stress is also one of the main ways that Daggerheart will track kind of willpower or interpersonal tension or strain between characters. The bard might be able to deal stress to a character, right? The grace domain has some abilities that cause adversaries to mark stress. Rangers can make adversaries mark stress, though that's mostly framed in a way that is combat oriented. But this last weekend, when I was running an encounter for CreatureCon using the materials that I had created as a stretch goal for the Impossible Creatures Kickstarter, it was a very interpersonal and social oriented scene, and a player who was who had a ranger character asked if they could possibly use their ranger's focus in a more interpersonal dimension. And so we talked that through and figured out a way to be able to do that so that the supernatural element or manifestation of the ranger's intense focus and scrutiny could apply in that scene. That was maybe a little bit of a stretch in terms of using the rules, but because this was a single encounter and because it was so interpersonally focused, I wanted to create more ways in, or more ways for different characters of different classes to be able to interact with the scene and be able to have like a cool mechanical impact on the scene. You might decide, I don't think a ranger's focus makes sense as something you can use in an interpersonal scene. Or maybe you think about it and go, yeah, you can use this, but if you use this against somebody, it's going to be taken as very aggressive. And so there's going to be some social consequences based on that, versus an ability that you might be able to bring to bear to try to convince someone or persuade somebody to do something without there being that dimension of hostility to it. As with a lot of these things, there's a bunch of judgment calls, rulings over rules, as the book says. In terms of adversary design for socials, what I often do is at least think about reaching a baseline of one passive, one action, and one reaction, right? 3 features. Some of the adversaries in the core book have only one feature, or maybe only 1 or 2. When I'm designing, I will often kind of spitball and design and then rearrange things and move abilities around, or change a feature from one type, from action to passive, or reaction to action, and things like that. I kind of iterate my way through, and thinking about how a passive, action, and reaction features might all interact helps me be able to realize the vision of what I want that adversary to be able to do. Not So Simpleton says, this might sound kind of basic, but I like the idea of a generic rival social adversary that includes questions and encourages flavoring to connect with the PC backstory. A way to encourage a more narrative encounter before a fight pops off, if it even does. Yeah, I think that is a fun way of presenting it, right? I'm going to scroll down here. One of the new adversaries I created was a Busybody, a meddling civilian determined to insert themselves into other people's business and gain status for themselves. I think it might not be too hard to take this Busybody and tweak them to fill that rival role. I did make rival adversaries that I posted on my Patreon, I think last week. Those were meant to be rival adventurers, where they can kind of make a big impact or a notable impact in a combat scene or an action scene. But I think the core idea that Not So Simpleton proposes of a generic rival adversary is really good, especially if we are designing toward flexibility and adaptability. the way I see a lot of the adversaries in the core book is that they are designed in a almost more archetypal fashion, so that then a GM can take them and tweak them to fit a given scene or situation. If you are designing for an adventure, or if you're designing for your own home game, you might design toward a really specific goal, right? Instead of a spectral guardian, it might be, Walton family wraith, right? Because this adventure is about investigating the Walton mansion, right? A fallen noble house who who all were wiped out by a curse, right? And then you're getting more specific so that you can have those that specific flavor to be able to kind of hit more deeply at something. I really like the idea of giving the questions or tools for a GM to be able to adjust or adapt a more generic adversary to the specific party. So that is an interesting idea we can come back to. So I'm just going to make a note here with the Busybody to see if we might be able to incorporate some of that idea. So I'm going to scroll back up here for my overall best practices, but I already love the conversation that we're having. Lucen Spookin asks, could you even tie the adversary's stress build-up to other action rolls made by the players, or even subtle interactions or fitting story reasons? Absolutely, right? I think especially in a scene that is not just the player characters against one social adversary, if a social adversary is in a larger conversation, you might decide to mark or clear stress on that adversary based on other things happening in the scene. In a more direct interpersonal conflict, I will often tell the players, hey, as a default, if you succeed on a social action against this adversary, I'm going to have them mark stress. And then if they have all of their stress marked, they're going to be vulnerable, and you're going to be able to convince them to do what you want or intimidate them. Or we think about their stress bar as like a social hit points if we need to use that kind of a structure. And that when you have eliminated all of those, you're in a position to defeat that adversary if you have like a more explicitly adversarial situation, as opposed to this social adversary is making things complicated in the scene, right? The courtesan might not be directly your enemy, but might be making things hard for you because the courtesan is acting in accordance with their own motives toward their own agendas and trying to get something from the player characters while the character is doing something else. So some notes about social adversaries before we dive into specific stat blocks. When building them, social adversaries tend to have lower damage thresholds and lower damage pools for their tier, right? They tend to be not as tough and not as harmful in a fight. The tier 2 spy from the SRD has thresholds of 8 and 17, which would be good if they were tier 1, but that's on the lower end for tier 2. You could even go lower, right? A spectral archer is a ranged adversary at tier 2, and their thresholds are 614. So social, you can go down a little bit more, but here I think it makes sense that the spy is a little bit tougher, because while they primarily pose an interpersonal threat, they could also pull a dagger in the right situation, right? If they've blended into a crowd or something like that. So we're thinking from the baseline and from the starting point of what is this person? What role do they play in the scene? The weapons or attacks that a social adversary uses don't have to be necessarily as fancy or special, right? A lot of them have like a knife or a sword, or maybe they have a wand if they can do magic to protect themselves. We still give them damage thresholds and like a standard attack with some kind of weapon or attack method so that you can use them in a fight if the social situation escalates to combat. It's not maybe as likely, and they're not going to be at their best in those situations, but if we're using the adversary framework in general, we're going to have those elements. I think that it can be really useful in building social adversaries to pay attention to their experiences and to consider giving them higher bonuses on the experiences, and or thinking about giving them maybe one more experience than you might otherwise give an adversary of that tier. Right? The spy has espionage +3, whereas a spectral guardian has ancient knowledge +2, as does a spectral archer. Thank you, Not a Hag. We'll hydrate here, try to make it not be noisy for folks. Okay, we're back. Experience design is also a really fun way of giving adversaries specific flavor, right? If we had the more generic rival adversary and then you're trying to personalize or make them more specific, tweaking the experiences that they have would be one of the ways that you can do that, right? Make them fit the region that they're in, the kingdom that they're in, the faction that they're aligned with, things like that. Pathfinder PhD says, I had an attempted assassin stab an NPC once a clock was filled via expenditure of fear during a social encounter. Perhaps having a spy that learns more depending on various clocks that may get filled, right? You could, as maybe a failure with hope move, introduce a countdown that you describe as, this spy is learning how you talk and your mannerisms, and I'm going to tick it down every time you make an action roll in this scene. And if this countdown triggers, they are going to have learned how you talk and move enough to impersonate you. The trick there is, does that character know this is happening? How do we negotiate and utilize the dramatic irony in that scene so that the ticking clock is not just relevant to the players, but manifests in some way that the player characters can react to? Sometimes we want to live in that dramatic irony because then we're afraid for the characters. But sometimes we want to be able to bring that tension home for the characters themselves. Right? You could do that countdown on your own. I think the harder version of the move would be that you just start a countdown in your own notes, or you just spend a fear and say, yeah, they watched you long enough to be able to impersonate you. Right? You have the fictional justification for doing that by having them in a previous scene, or you spend another fear to flash back and reveal, hey, actually, so the person who is at the table next to you was a spy and they were tracking and following you to try to be able to learn how you talk and move to impersonate you. Right? When you have a harder move, then I feel like it can be easier, or it's easier to justify doing things like a flashback, establishing that something was already extant. You just didn't know about it. As Sam Reich would say, I've been here the whole time. So we've talked a little bit about stress already, and talking about the different types of features before we go into specific new design. A passive feature, right? This is, how does this NPC move through the world, or what is their status within the world that is different than anybody else? How are they more or less adept at certain things or in certain situations? What is just always the case when they are around, right? What energy do they bring to a scene, right? You could have a social adversary that was a worrywart, and one of their passives is bad vibes, right? And that when a worrywart is in the scene, your hope die is decreased or something, right? Increasing the fear die from 12 to 20 is a bigger deal maybe than reducing your hope die from 12 to 10. Or a worrywart might say, whenever a player character marks stress from as part of a consequence, they have to mark an additional stress, right? Because the worrywart is like, oh no, are you okay? Right? They're exacerbating something that's already happening. So for action features, right? These are big moves that a social adversary can make in a scene that will have some kind of impact on the scene, right? An action feature should create a story beat, right? Where there's a change in the tone or content or direction of a scene, right? Everything was going fine until the advisor character leaned over and whispered in the ear of the queen, spreading a false rumor about you, right? And then the queen's demeanor toward you changes. That's a story beat as a result of the particular adversary action, right? And that turning an NPC against the player characters or pushing in that direction is somewhere in the like medium to medium hard range, right? It's not an immediate hard move where the queen says arrest them, but it does push the temperature of the scene in a particular direction. Social adversaries can also kind of be manipulators, right? They could take an action that mobilizes other characters against the PCs, like the queen, or swaying a crowd. Or they could make direct accusations that maybe cause a reaction roll or take stress, or that might just deal stress directly. A note on fear features. Thanks for hanging out, Rachel. See you later. Giving social adversaries fear features that will give the GM fear is something that probably takes a little bit of extra care. But in general, giving social adversaries fear features is great because it will give you specific uses for fear outside of combat, right? I did a whole video on using fear outside of combat, and unless I'm mistaken, one of the things that was included was social adversaries, their fear actions, improvising fear actions in social situations or in other scenes, right? Giving adversaries fear features also means that you can have more powerful features that should require a cost without that cost always being stress. Because if a social adversary has to mark stress to use their abilities, that also means that they are easier to wear down when the player characters are dealing them stress. But if you're spending fear instead, that's not coming from the individual adversary, right? That's coming from your overall fear pool. That's more like the hand of fate intervening rather than that particular character taxing themselves as much. Oh yeah, like a scarecrow type villain would be amazing. The idea that I had as a potential new one to build was a trickster spirit. And I think a scarecrow type adversary would not be too far from that. Another thing that would be fun to think about and might be outside of the scope of this stream would be a big bad who is a social adversary, right? They might be a social with some elements of being a leader, but they are not the one that is going to be fighting back and forth with you with violence in the climactic scene, right? They might have a lieutenant who is the physical threat, but they are mostly a interpersonal threat. The character Lex Luthor in a fair bit of his history is like a social mastermind character. There's times when he has like a super suit and then it becomes more direct, but a lot of the ways that Lex Luthor operates are more like a social adversary / a leader, right? They have other people to do things for them. A manipulator in the sidelines, absolutely, right? There are folks who dislike the fact that Palpatine was also a master lightsaber duelist because they liked Palpatine as a puppet master social maneuverer who did not get his hands dirty directly. And I think that's a fair argument. An adversary that does not look intimidating, but is a intimidated gambler. Have him decrease the hope die, make the players lose hope. I'm not familiar with Boardwalk Empire, unfortunately, not a hag. I would say if the way that they're intimidating is that they just subtly make other people worse, then that might be something like looking at the basically the pirate features on the pirate adversaries, where if you roll less than a certain number, even if you succeed, you have to mark a stress, right? And you set that number based on maybe this adversary's difficulty plus a relevant experience. For the pirates, that number is about damage based on how much damage the player characters do. But in a social situation, we're not really rolling damage, so you might look for another place to make that work. Actually, I'm going to double check pirates because they may be changed. This is the problem with having like 8 versions of the game in your head, is that sometimes I remember something from like 3 versions ago. Where's my pirates? Swashbuckler. Yeah, that's about damage. Okay, great. Small eats cake, smiles nicely, but everyone loses to him if they ever play against him. Yeah, I think if that adversary is not actively intimidating, then maybe we write a passive feature that says the player characters don't automatically know that adversary is the one who is causing this problem, right? And then maybe that passive feature includes an option that says characters can make an instinct roll to notice the ways that this character is subtly intimidating or chilling other characters, right? If they're chilling based on reputation, then maybe that's about how they impact other people in the scene. But that is a bit tricky, right? Because it seems like it's very subtle. I think so. Loose and Spook, and to your note, there are definitely already features in the core book that make player characters lose hope. They're not especially common. I think in a situation like this, it could be an option. But what I might do is look at different features under that same adversary and have maybe one that causes characters to lose hope and then another one that causes them to mark stress, so that they are not threatening characters only along one axis of their resources or abilities. Because if they had several different things that made them lose hope, then yeah, that could get really punishing. Okay, so going back to my notes here real quick. Reactions. A notable thing about reaction features, this is in general, but especially for social adversaries, is that these give the GM a specific trigger to be able to make a move, even if the player characters are rolling successes with hope. Because in most cases, a reaction feature for me is an explicitly written situation where there are natural consequences based on the player character's actions, which is one of the prompts in the book that suggests the GM make a move, right? There's like the 5 different options: when they roll with fear, when they roll a failure, but also when they do something that would have consequences. The reaction is, this is a feature that says when they do this, this is the consequence. That will let a social adversary kind of act, quote unquote, out of turn, even though what it really is it's specifically generating a GM turn to use that one particular feature, right? It's not as versatile as just the GM gets to make a move, because it's very specific. But what it should do is create incentives and disincentives for the player characters as they come to understand the mechanical manifestations of the results of their fictional actions. So features that use countdowns or create like a ticking clock will give you a way to be more specific or more granular in a scene that might otherwise feel a bit more freeform, right? Like this is the countdown representing the magistrate's patience. And every time you make an action roll to try to ask something of the magistrate, I'm going to tick it down by 1. Or this is a consequence countdown for the magistrate's patience. You're going to have to roll well to be able to get through this process without having the magistrate get fed up with you. We're using countdowns to track things so that the GM doesn't have to just hold relative subjective elements in their head as much, right? It lets you externalize and make specific some of these measures of fictional realities. As an example of kind of the way that social adversaries can use countdowns, right? This is from the Monarch adversary, which is on page 93 of the SRD, the casus belli feature, right? Casus belli is like justification for war. This is like a European thing. Largely military, medieval European, but not exclusively, right? You spend a fear to activate this feature after the monarch's desire for war is first revealed. We could rewrite this as just an action, but having it be a reaction gives it a little bit more like of a surprise element. This starts a long-term countdown at 8. Long-term countdowns as a default, the way that you can specifically count them down without having to like spend fear is every long rest, the GM ticks 1 long-term countdown by 1. The way I play it, you could spend fear to also advance that countdown. And when this countdown triggers, the monarch has a reason to be able to rally the nation to war and the support to act on that reason. It's not just a justification, it's a justification that is enough to mobilize people. And when that happens, then the GM gains 1d4 fear because a nation is going to war, and that's a scary thing. If this casus belli is trying to get a nation to go to war in defense of something good, I'd probably express this in a different way. For me, this casus belli feature is one that I would use to measure a nation getting ready to take aggressive action as like in an antagonistic or villainous way. So social adversaries can be a great way to generate fear, and you can use fear on them, right? I talked about fear features earlier, but one of my favorite examples of how a social adversary can generate fear is the fly on the wall feature from the Spy. When a PC or group is discussing something sensitive, you can mark a stress to reveal that the spy is present in the scene, observing them. If the spy escapes the scene to report their findings, you gain 1d4 fear, right? Fear grows and advances because your plans have been found out. Now, it might not make sense for fear to grow if the only thing the spy has learned is what you like for breakfast. But again, this comes down to beginning with the fiction and playing in good faith. And then as a last note, as with other adversaries, if an adversary's feature costs fear, it probably, but not always, but it probably shouldn't generate fear unless there is a countdown or some other condition, right? Casus belli starts a countdown, and then at the end of that countdown, when it triggers, you gain fear. So the time when you start it and when it pays off is pretty separated. I would probably also say that any given monarch can probably only have one casus belli clock or countdown at a time, because gathering the national will to go to war with several different nations is a big deal. With adversaries in like Age of Umbra, right? Spoilers for episode 2 of Age of Umbra for just like 30 seconds. Okay, you've been warned. Velk in episode 2 of Age of Umbra has momentum, where he generates fear when he makes a successful attack, and relentless, where he can make up to 2 moves in a GM turn, right? So you could activate, attack, gain a fear, spend that fear to attack again to gain a fear. Right there, so there is a feedback loop you can generate with that. For a social adversary, if they are the main villain, right? If you have a Xanatos or a Lex Luthor, then I probably don't worry about them having a fear feature that generates fear, as long as that loop feels like this is the villain hatching and succeeding, or hatching and manifesting schemes and plots. Right? They go through a flywheel of they're doing the thing that they do as a villain. And the player characters should have chances to be able to interrupt or block that. Because then, if they do have this ability to create a flywheel, the player characters really are going to want to interfere, because otherwise the GM is just going to have seemingly endless fear. So, that's some overall thoughts about social adversaries. And now I want to talk a little bit about some new social adversaries I've made, and then let's make at least one new one together. So my Busybody is a meddling civilian, right? We have their motives and tactics: exaggerate the truth, find gossip, glorify themselves, stir up controversy. Their difficulty is not especially high, because this is a tier 1 Busybody. They are not a courtier, right? They are not necessarily trained in a bigger way, but they can present a threat here, right? 3 experiences at +3 is a lot, right? I might drop local knowledge, or I might drop attention seeker, because attention seeker and gossip, maybe they overlap too much and don't provide as much versatility. Maybe I do that, right? As discussed, they have low attack bonuses. They don't deal much damage. Their thresholds are really low. But 4 stress is not insignificant for a tier 1 adversary. And noticeably, a Busybody is a practiced manipulator. Up to 3 times per scene, the Busybody may utilize an experience without spending fear. Right? That lets the GM say, for this role, the Busybody is going to utilize their gossip experience, and it's actually going to be difficulty 14 to contradict them at the town meeting and convince people that this is all just rumor, not reality. Or they could spend fear to utilize an experience if they were making a reaction roll. Right? If there was a feature from a social character who said, a target has to make a reaction roll 14 or mark 2 stress. Oh, okay, well, this is interpersonal. It makes sense that a Busybody is an attention seeker, so they want to be able to be in the spotlight without consequence. So I'm going to spend fear and add their attention seeker experience to this reaction roll that I make. Right? Their action, they have 2 actions here. Meddling. Right? You spend a fear to reveal that the Busybody has been basically following the situation and is going to insert themselves into what's going on to push the situation in some way. Right? Each PC present must make a presence reaction roll or mark a stress from the overbearing presence of this Busybody. Right? They're getting in the way and they're causing everybody headaches. And then somebody has to do something about this is maybe a bit bigger of a scale of an action. Spend a fear to have the Busybody rile up a crowd, demanding that they take action regarding recent events in the community. Start a consequence countdown at 5, representing the Busybody's efforts to force action. The Busybody may only have one of these countdowns active at a time, so limiting the ways that they can generate more fear, and not making the scene too complicated, right? At a certain point, having more countdowns might create more friction than the help that it creates by externalizing things, because you have to keep track of all these different countdowns. If the countdown triggers before the Busybody is convinced to relent or the crowd is dissipated, the crowd will take drastic and ill-advised action, and you will gain 1d4 + 1 fear. right? Somebody has to do something about this. We need to go out to the tower and kill the beast, right? Beauty and the Beast, the Disney animated feature, right? Riling up the crowd is a scary thing that's going to cause more problems. And so if the player characters can't kind of de-escalate, a lynch mob / an angry mob goes out to try to kill the beast, and you gain fear. And as a reaction, how rude. When a PC rebuffs or challenges the busybody on their involvement in a situation or their advice, mark a stress to cause the offending PC to mark a stress, right? What they want to do is interfere. And if someone pushes back, then the busybody weaponizes politeness, kind of uses their social capabilities as a rebuke, and makes that other person mark a stress. It's kind of mutually assured stressing. And then I have a higher tier social adversary, the Herald of Conquest. This is sort of like a fantasy version of the Herald of Galactus, but this would be like the herald of a conquering warlord. At tier 3, difficulty 16, right? This is not an insignificant threat socially. Their motives and tactics: cow civilians, deliver fell tidings, satisfy their master, undermine resistance, right? The herald is sent ahead of the warlord's horde to try to convince people to just not fight. Just lay down your arms and nothing bad will happen to you. They have a passive aura of superiority. Anytime a PC rolls a result with fear while in the presence of the herald, they must mark a stress. Presence of is a little vague. I might tweak this to within far distance. Within very far is basically just in the scene. But maybe you want this more specific. Loose and spookin'. Mutually assured stressing is what I have with my roommate. Oh, I'm sorry. That's a bummer. Your Doom Comes is a 2 fear action where they deliver news of their master's imminent arrival. They list many victories and unbeatable prowess and the host that the warlord commands. All targets within far must make a presence reaction roll or mark 2 stress, right? The herald is listing off all this scary stuff. Silence Worm is an action. Mark a stress to pick a target within far. The target must make a presence reaction roll, right? We have presence reaction rolls because this is a herald who is trying to intimidate people. On a failure, they become cowed. While cowed, they are vulnerable and must mark a stress each time they speak out against the herald. The target clears cowed if they succeed with hope on a roll against the herald or other agents of the conqueror, right? Basically, if they successfully speak out or speak up against them, or at the end of the next rest, right? They get over being cowed when they have a bit of time to collect themselves. And then some reactions. Snarling Contempt. Naming features is one of my favorite things. When a PC makes a presence roll against the herald, mark a stress to give that roll disadvantage as the herald's contempt washes over the PC like a wave. Thank you for the reminder to scroll. And my master is not without mercy. Any target that declares their loyalty to the herald's master or surrenders proactively becomes spared and suborned. While spared and suborned, they cannot clear stress, but they are granted reprieve from the worst of the oncoming conquest. A target cannot clear this status unless they take active and dangerous action to undermine the conqueror, right? So this is like that scene in Avengers where Loki tells everybody to kneel and, talks about how kind of humans are worms and whatever, right? And you have the old guy who stands up, right? He did not surrender and takes that more direct action, right? He is not cowed, or even if he was, he clears it because he takes brave action against Loki in that scene. What I'm trying to do here is give some mechanical weight and manifestation to the types of story beats that would show up in a scene like this, right? The mouth of Sauron in the Lord of the Rings films, directed by Peter Jackson, right? What happens and what's the vibe of a scene where a herald is trying to get everybody to surrender, right? It is about intimidation. It is about pushing a whole crowd to doing something, or to basically create a tragedy of the commons. I think that's the thing. Basically, no, bystander effect, sorry. Where unless somebody does something, a lot of other people won't do anything, right? Because being the one person to speak out, being the person to break from what everyone else is doing, can be really hard for many people, like psychologically. And so these features weaponize that against the warlord's targets. And the fun thing with these is when they're named the right way, you can just work this into the dialogue, and that is already a prompt, right? The line tells you what it is, but also it's one that you can deliver in the fiction. Okay, so now I'm going to move this, and the idea that I had was a trickster spirit. Not a Hag says, I liked how the mouth of Sauron showed everyone Frodo's chainmail, making them believe Frodo is caught while Mordor only had his clothing. Fantastic example, right? That would be a place where the GM might say, I'm going to spend a fear and utilize the mouth of Sauron's experience, misdirection, or prey upon fear, and then present something as if it were more than what it actually is. So the trickster spirit here, I am thinking of trickster type characters, like supernatural tricksters in various bits of world folklore. I'm also thinking of Mr. Mxyzptlk from DC Comics, right? What I want here is somebody who is really annoying and is going to cause you problems, but is mostly not about hurting you physically, right? They might lead you into danger. They might cause you to have problems, but also I want features that are like they shapeshift into one of the player characters when the group is separated, and then they show up and talk to a player character, and that player character had been like meaning to say something, and then they say it to the trickster spirit, but that's not actually saying it to the person, right? There's scenes like this. The idea is that you can create drama by manipulating social situations, right? Spoilers for K-pop Demon Hunters, which is a fabulous movie that I recommend pretty universally. In Act 3 of K-pop Demon Hunters, right, there's a scene where there's some shape-shifting that pushes a character in a different direction, and basically causes that character stress, because the actions that the shape-shifted characters take are seen as a betrayal by this main character. I'm not as familiar with Batmite, actually, Not a Hag. I've read some stuff with Mr. Mxyzptlk. I guess Batmite came up in the like Zur-En-Augh era of Batman stuff, didn't he? If I'm remembering correctly. Anyway, so I want to do his trickster spirit here. And so I think I want to start with features, because a lot of the rest of this can just flow from where we end up developing this adversary in general. So this shapeshifting is going to be a passive, right? I think the spirit can assume the form of any number of humanoids, including the PCs and their loved ones, as long as they've seen the target in person. Right, this sort of limits what this trickster spirit can do in terms of shapeshifting. And depending on how I was using them in the scene, I might change that requirement. I have the shapeshifting here. What I want is to include some mechanical guidance to the GM on how the player characters can realize this isn't the real XYZ, right? A PC can, let's see, right? Because the players might know, but then if the player is calling for a role, is that a little metagamey? So what I might do is when the spirit interacts with a PC while posing as someone the PC knows, the PC can make an instinct reaction roll to realize that something is off. Right? That gives latitude for the GM to say, oh, well, you got a crit, so you know for sure that this is not your friend / this other PC. So that's a core element that's pretty cool here. If I wanted to limit this, I might turn the shapeshifting into a action and make the spirit mark a stress to do it or spend a fear. For an action, I think I want unburden your heart. And the idea here is that the trickster spirit is going to try to find a subject, like a topic to talk about, where the player character is going to like reveal a secret or confess their emotions or something, but then realize that they didn't do it to the real person, or the spirit can just be satisfied that they have manipulated somebody in such a way. Well, if, so not a hag, if the, I don't remember the exact wording of the Void ancestor, the current version of the gnome, because I don't follow the Void stuff super closely because it's not eligible for reference in creations using the community gaming license. And so I have not internalized some of the stuff from the Void in the same way. Does the gnome just say you can always see through illusions, or is it like do you get advantage on seeing through illusions? Because if it's the latter, that works just fine with this feature as written. Yeah, if it's just advantage, it should be fine. Sorry, I was muted because I didn't want the drinking sound on the mic. Unburden your heart should definitely be a fear action. To open up a line of conversation, open up a sensitive line of and to try and bait a PC into an emotional confession, or to reveal a secret they'd been holding on to. What I want to do here is I want to make it easy for the player to play along so that we can have the drama, right? Even if the player knows that this is this trickster spirit, but the character doesn't, I want to incentivize the player to be a good sport. I could just say, well, the principles of the game basically suggest that you should be a good sport. But I think it can be easier if there's also a mechanical manifestation of that. So if the PC goes with the with, how would I want the wording here, right? If the PC takes up the topic and makes an right? If the PC takes up the topic and makes a meaningful confession or disclosure, they gain 2 hope. Right? That there is hope in finally doing the thing. The trick there is when the trickster does a reveal, does that lead to that character losing hope? Do I say instead that when a character does that, they clear stress, and then when it's revealed what happened, they lose hope? Because if they gain hope by confessing and then lose hope with the reveal, I don't love that, because it might too easily lead to a null result. Right? And so if I have it be stress, then and then I think the big reveal, this I think is they transform back from the form they were in to gloat after something has happened, right? And so this could be an action or it could be a reaction. When a character opens up to the spirit, or when it would be most heartbreaking, the spirit drops their transformation and reveals that they were never the character the PC thought. The PC must make a presence reaction roll or lose 1d4 hope. Right? Maybe 1d4, like 1d4 could be a lot. It could be a little. For this, I think I do want this to require the spirit mark of stress. Thematically, this feels more like a fear expenditure, because it shouldn't necessarily be stressful to do the reveal. So instead, I'm going to say fear, spend a fear. I do want to give the spirit something that they can do that costs them stress. So maybe this is mark of stress. Right? It's stressful for them because what they're trying to do is make really specific comments that lead or tease out specific types of confessions from the character. So I feel a little better about that. So mark a stress for unburden your heart, and spend a fear for the big reveal. The spirit clears a number of stress. Right? The PC marks stress and the spirit clears stress because they're so delighted by the drama. A more malevolent version of this might instead say gain fear equal to the number of stress marked. Right? Where it's about like sowing discord. Because we could also have an action, or maybe we have a separate action that is divided you fall. Right, and this is also mark of stress. To say something hurtful or mistrustful of other PCs around, of characters, and force a PC to mark a stress. Right. What I want is, this is the trickster spirit saying, making something up that causes a player character to mistrust another player character, right? Divided you fall. Kind of trying to find weak spots in this party's like interpersonal connections, and then go at those to create drama and chaos. What we might also do is create some kind of feature that is about gaining information from the player character. To give the GM a little bit more guidance of what the spirit knows and how they know these things. So I might also do watching from the shadows. Right? Spend a fear to introduce the trickster spirit in hiding to observe the PCs and learn their relationships and anxieties, right? Explicit guidance on introduce the spirit in this fashion so that then you have the fictional justification to be able to make these moves. Dorkside VO says, I love the flavor of Unburden Your Heart. Would you maybe want to do a carrot and stick where if they don't open up, something happens like the masks move provoke someone? I think that is a great suggestion. So let's go back and look at Unburden Your Heart. If they do not take up the topic, so this might be mark stress, right? They mark a stress as they suppress these powerful emotions, right? The goal of the Trickster Spirit is to find something where the character does want to reveal the thing or say the thing, right? The character wants to confess their love to the NPC companion they're with, right? The character wants to make it clear to their ally that they do all of these things. They're tough on them because they care and they are desperately afraid of losing someone else, right? We want to hit at emotions and give them some mechanical manifestations, right? So if they don't take up the topic, maybe this is a presence reaction roll, right? Maybe it has a better thing, or maybe it's just, if they don't take up the topic, gain a fear, right? Because things unsaid are often unsaid because you're afraid of what happens if you do say them. But when you don't say them, that fear can just grow, right? Right? If they don't take up the topic, gain a fear. Yeah, like Dorkside VO says, it doesn't punish the player directly. Ideally, the GM is doing this in a way that... Sorry, I'm just going to move this down to make it easier to see all these features. Ideally, the GM is finding the topics that they know from conversations with the other players are the interesting things to have a scene about in a situation, right? In one of the games that I run, there's a character whose whole village was destroyed and wants to gain power and knowledge to be able to prevent that from happening again. And so in a scene with a trickster spirit and that character, for Divided You Fall or Unburden Your Heart and that PC, I would have the spirit pose as one of the other player characters and then say something that would kind of provoke this player character toward self-doubt about the ability to protect people, or make them feel guilty about somebody not being able to, about them not having saved somebody, right? I don't want to go too many features on this stat block because I also want to leave room for the GM to improvise. When I write motives and tactics, I might include other things that the GM could use as improvised features that they also do, right? So it could be provoke questions, so doubt, mine guilt, right? This is more tactics, right? Motives would be do it for the drama, right? If this is like a puckish spirit that just lives for the drama. Right? Be the most, right? The most, right? If this were 5 years ago, I might say just be extra. Right? Impersonate loved ones. This is maybe more motives and tactics than I need, but maybe it's nice to have a few extras of these for a social adversary, especially one that is trying to operate in the way that this trickster spirit is, right? Trying to really go deep at emotion and motivation and story arc and things. So to any of my players who are watching, I'm going to apologize in advance because I'm absolutely using this trickster spirit on some of you. That's my ain't I a stinker look. So we're at about an hour 15 now, and I think I feel pretty good about these core features on the trickster spirit. I want to say thank you to everybody who is here live, who gave their suggestions and ideas. I think that, right, like basically a mean girl type social adversary is such a fun idea. My voice is a little tired because I've not slept super great this week and I've had to do a lot of talking. So I think I'm going to wrap it here. But Rachel, next time we talk, let's brainstorm a fantasy mean girl. Oh, Dorkside's VO is suggesting like an attack that is right. So cutting words, far, 2d8 magic damage, right? Something like that, where it's literally just a social attack. Yeah, close is probably better, right? Close enough to be able to be in conversation, right? If this is the way they're attacking, I probably don't want to give them a low attack bonus because I'm going to default at sometimes to using the cutting words. Now, what would be fun, like really fun, is I don't do physical damage or magic damage. The attack just deals stress, right? And I might the spirits cutting words attack causes, or basically I'm explaining, right, when the spirit succeeds with a cutting words attack, the target marks stress instead of taking damage, right? That is almost the same as just having a feature that is an action set that called cutting words, make an attack. On a success, the target marks stress. But it's kind of fun to just have that be the basic attack, right? Target marks stress. Pretty cool. In playtesting or for formatting, this might end up changing, right? And we might give them like a rapier as a default weapon. But then that's not really going to be the focus. Having a basic attack that causes the target to mark stress, maybe makes that more usable in some ways, and that's pretty fun to think about. So good suggestion, Dorkside VO. Now we're going to go ahead and wrap up. This has been very fun. I love this Trickster spirit. I am going to do terrible things. The trick with this, is that if you have higher evasion, you're better protected against the cutting words, which maybe makes a little bit less sense, but it's also fun to think about, right? Because evasion is not, evasion is your physical protection, but there's a lot of ways that that can manifest. So I think the alternative on this would be that as an action, cutting words makes a target, or has a target make a, an instinct or a presence reaction roll, and on a failure they mark a stress. But I'm going to leave this funny, weird attack as it is right now, and reserve the right to change my idea later. Thank you so much, Not a Hag. Thank you for your suggestions. Thanks also to Sangre00, Dorkside VO, Lucen Spookin, Not So Simpleton, Pathfinder PhD, Racial Tensions, and trying to make sure I catch everybody. And of course, to everybody who is watching later on the Twitch VOD or over on YouTube, if you have questions about social adversaries or ideas that you want to throw in on top of what's already here, or types of social adversaries you would love to see, then please go ahead and leave those as comments or questions on the YouTube video of this when it shows up tomorrow, probably tomorrow morning. Or you can go to my Patreon and comment on any number of the public posts related to this stream. Those are probably the easiest places where you can comment or ask questions in a way that I will be able to get to. So there is that. As a reminder, if folks do not already know, or two things. One, Critical Role Season 4 starts tomorrow. They are playing D&D 5e, but the better Critical Role does, probably the more resources they will have to put into Daggerheart. That's just a guess. I don't have access. I'm not privy to their financials at all. Two, there is a Kickstarter right now for Daggerheart class packs. These are mostly, as I understand it, for players who either want like backup set of cards for their character, or they want just the cards for their character and they don't want to buy the main book. Right? So there's some specific use cases. It's already funded, so it's going to happen. They're using Kickstarter to kind of gauge interest. So you can check that out and see if that is something you want to pledge to. It seems like they're going to come to retail afterward, so you have that option. And then probably, fingers crossed, next week I might have some news of my own. Plotty fingers. I will leave you with the suspense. Okay. Thanks for hanging out, y'all. Take care.